Okay, thanks very much. I am going to adopt the strategy of speaking in English but having slides in Italian. Okay, I'm sorry I can't speak French, so there's no French in this. Okay, so this is the second part of the project by the University of Turin and the Parchi Alpi Cozie, okay, looking at the distribution of alpine ibex. I have to say that I'm speaking, Enrico Caprio led all the analyses. Right, so how does this work? It worked before. Am I supposed to use the Rotello? No.
Yes, yes. Rotella.
Rotella. Più o meno. Okay, right. So, a modelling approach. What does that mean? What does that do? Well, this is obviously quite a complicated statistical approach. And what it can do is basically describe mathematically relationships between the locations of our animals and their habitat. And we can then use that information to ask interesting ecological questions. For example, are these populations connected? Or what will be the consequences of climate change in the future? So these are the three objectives of this part of the project. So first, we're looking at developing these spatial models of habitat suitability. Then we're going to use those models to quantify the ecological connectivity of the habitat in our study area, which incidentally is basically the main study area, the whole of the Western Italian Alps. And then we're also going to use that model to try and predict potential consequences of climate change for this species. So just to recap, the data we're analysing here is based on different sources. The main source, of course, is, sorry, this is all turned up the wrong way, are the animals fitted with GPS collars. So we have 184 animals in this sample in total. But that's not the sample size. As you've seen, you remember Enrico's figure with all those tiny little dots. Each one is a location of an animal. So there are 184 animals, but there are thousands and thousands of data points. So it's a huge, fantastic data set, in fact. We've also topped this up with observations from citizen science programs listed here. Okay? So it's quite a decent sample size. Actually, that sample is fairly trivial compared to the actual sample size of observations from this data set. So for each of those thousands and thousands of points, each of those points, we're interested in what is the habitat use. So for each of those points, using a GIS, we can extract information about the surrounding habitat. So there are basically three groups here: topography, habitat, and climate. I'm using habitat suitability in a very general sense, including all environmental variables, okay? So topography includes, for example, the elevation, okay, the slope, whether the location of an animal is more facing north or more facing east. There are also two indices of terrain complexity. We also have 9 different measures of habitat vero e proprio, as we would think of habitat. For example, the cover of forest surrounding the point, the cover of shrubby habitat surrounding the point, the cover of sparse vegetation surrounding the point. And at the end, we have our climatic variables. So I've listed 3 there: temperature, precipitation, solar radiation. There's actually a lot more variables considered because there are many different ways of expressing temperature, precipitation, etc. So we've got a huge data set here. And what we did was we used a maximum entropy model approach to analyse this data, appropriate for this kind of data. Does anyone want to know the details of the maximum entropy modelling approach? I thought not, and I didn't include any technical details, all right? So I don't think it's particularly appropriate, particularly after lunch and the amount of wine that we've drunk. So, okay. So basically what that does, formally, it estimates the probability of one of our points being in a particular place in relation to habitat. In other words, it practically identifies habitat suitability and what are the features that make up habitat suitability. Okay? So we ran this model separately for males and females, and we ran it separately for each of the 4 seasons, and finally we did this at 2 different scales. The smaller scale is what we call the habitat model, so that includes habitat cover at a fairly fine scale. The climate model was at the broader scale, includes climate variables, both include topography. So, moving straight on to the results, I'll look at the results, 3 sets of results in relation to the 3 objectives. The first thing to say, again, without going into the technical details, this number here means the models are good. We can trust them. We think they're reliable. We think they describe the distribution of our animals very well. And we found, basically, according to our models, that about 30% of the entire area provides suitable habitat currently for the alpine ibex. And this is one thing we can do with this. One thing very useful with the modelling approach is we can make a map. So here we have models of males and females in summer, and this is identifying the best habitat. So the darker colours are the better areas. Hopefully you can already see that there might be conservation uses of these kind of maps to identify important areas. But we want to do more than that. We want to say, well, why are these areas important? What's driving these patterns? And we can actually use our individual variables, look at our individual variables to understand what are the key environmental components. Again, I'm not going into detail. So here we have the associations of all of them, okay? So it's quite difficult to work. So this is basically the probability of finding an ibex, okay? And these are all the environmental variables. The name is written at the top of the graph. Again, I won't go into details, but we know that the 2 most important variables are elevation, that's altitudine, elevation, and whether it's the degree to which it faces the north. So this is non-linear, so basically we're most likely to encounter an ibex. It's difficult to say, but basically it's more or less between 1,500 and 2,500 metres. We don't find them at all. The probability is almost 0 of one of our ibex being found less than 1,000 metres and greater than 3,000 metres. Okay? And for this, 1 here means a slope facing directly north. So this obviously means that it's a very low probability of finding an ibex on a north-facing slope. So this is for males in winter. I can't go through all the seasons and all the sexes, so I'm just going to summarise some of the key findings. That is, the most important variables were elevation, terrain ruggedness, so that means non so come si dice rugosità, okay? Whether a slope is facing north or not, and the cover of sparse vegetation. So, more in detail. The ibex avoid areas facing north, especially in the winter. They prefer steeper slopes, particularly in spring. They prefer areas with little vegetation, open, sparsely vegetated areas. Okay? Not surprisingly, they move downslope, they select areas a little bit lower in the winter, but the females tend to occupy a wider elevation gradient. Many of you who work in the field will know this. I know this, I've seen ibex. We have an idea in our heads of what they like. The point is here, we can actually quantify it. We can quantify it, and then we can use that information. The second objective was to identify ecological corridors. Again, it doesn't matter how we did this, okay, for today. The point is, we can identify areas that are connected, more or less. So this is a map of the connectivity across our area. The darker the colour, the greater the degree of connectivity. And this is it's not in connecting animals, this is important. It's connecting areas of suitable habitat. So we have very highly suitable areas connected with the red line. The darker areas are still quite highly connected, the yellow, more or less. There's not much to say on this section, except that in general, actually, the connectedness in terms of habitat is pretty high. We can pick on some certain areas, particularly identified here, 2 outlying areas, which some of you will know, which are clearly very isolated. In fact, one of these areas where the species has been introduced. Okay, so that is something potentially to look at if we want to maintain those populations in the future. Okay, moving on to the third part, perhaps the most important part, is that we can use these models to kind of make some kind of prediction for the future. So the approach is the same, we're just operating at a different scale and we're using climate rather than habitat. The point is here, we can describe the current distribution using the current climate. Then we can substitute the current climate for future climate predictions, and then we can make predictions about what might be the consequences for the ibex. Okay, I'll skip over the bit about temperature. Where do these predictions come from? Well, they come from the IPCC. You must have seen these kind of predictions, okay? So these are standard, they're produced all the time. These are the standard predictions. Anything you hear about climate change, they'll be based on these kind of predictions. So they're very pessimistic scenarios here. We decided to take a conservative approach and use a fairly optimistic scenario that future climate warming will not be too bad. Okay, so you should bear that in mind for the results. I should just say, this bit is quite important. So we didn't look at a range of different scenarios, but we did look at different model selections. It's never a good idea to be reliant on one single model. Okay, so that gives us a bit of variation in our forecasts. So this is a kind of output on a map. This is the current situation, the climatically and topographically suitable areas. And this is the situation for the future. According to this model, obviously, there's less blue, so we're losing a lot of potentially suitable areas for the species. We look in more detail. Okay, so here I'm going to look, here the dark green areas a predicted loss. The pale green stays the same. The yellow is a gain. Let's focus in on this area. It's pretty obvious that there's a lot more dark green than yellow. Okay, there are far more losses than gains. And this, of our 3 different models, this is the most conservative. So if we summarise these results, actually, we look across all our models with sexes and seasons and so on. It's quite a big range, but the minimum is a 30% loss of suitable habitat. Okay? If we take an average across all our different models and sexes and seasons, we're expecting about a 50% loss in range, suitable areas for this species over the course of this century. Okay? Now, interpreting these things has to be done with caution, okay? Si deve prendere con le pinze. Yeah? Because there are lots of assumptions. We can't use this as saying this will happen. We can say it might happen. These models don't take into account any mechanisms. They don't take into account habitat. They don't take into account biological interactions, okay? And they don't take into account physiological adaptations or behavior. But they can act as a kind of warning sign of what could happen. We call it a what-if scenario. In italiano, che succederà se. Che cosa succederà se, scusate. Okay? So they're very useful, nonetheless. Oops. So in conclusion, so we've identified the preferred areas for alpine ibex, okay? We think there's a pretty good connectivity, but that's in terms of suitable habitat. Just because there's suitable habitat connected in these areas, of course, doesn't mean they're going to move. That's a behavioural issue, and behaviour is not in this, and I guess the next speaker will probably talk about this more. Okay? So it's also important about the interpretation of these models. We think that climate change has a potential to drastically reduce the suitable areas of these species. Okay? We can do better with these models, we can develop them, we can do demographic models and so on, but this is a really good start. Okay. So hopefully I've shown you our general approach. I think there's some quite important findings here. Hopefully I've convinced you that these modelling approaches can actually be useful eventually to start developing conservation strategies. So just to finish, there's a lot of acknowledgements here, but in particular, thank you very much for all of the people, including some people here, who've done such a fantastic job collecting what is an amazing data set. So, grazie per la vostra attenzione.
I don't know exactly how you build the models. So I was just wondering if, because I'm rather surprised of the super high suitability that we have really down south.
Yeah, so are we.
Can it be related to the fact that we had more data here than in other parts of the...
Well, it shouldn't be.
Okay.
There shouldn't be a data bias the way these models work, right? I think, I mean, what I would suggest, Enrico could probably tell better, I mean, I think possibly that some of the other features, like topography, for example, are really good, so they supersede those of climate effects. Because down south, I don't know the projections, but you expect further south, there'd be a greater degree of warming. So I don't know, Enrico, do you want to add to that?
No, but I mean, the same question would arise for the current situation.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, as far as I know, with the Maxent approach, there shouldn't be a bias towards the amount of data. Can you just, I think it's safe just for a minute to do that. Sì, quello è anche importante perché, no, come ho detto, non solo la temperatura, ci sono altri aspetti.
Se parli così.
Per definire questo modello abbiamo usato, questo modello stagionale, adesso penso, non mi ricordo se si tratta di quello invernale, probabilmente abbiamo usato la media invernale, le precipitazioni cumulate e il range di temperature, che sono le variabili che erano un pochino più significative dai modelli preliminari che abbiamo fatto. E, dobbiamo ancora approfondire questo aspetto, però effettivamente non è che se fossimo stati al Gran Paradiso avevamo un'altra mappa più blu, no, sto scherzando, cioè, non è perché siamo qua, però effettivamente è così, è sicuramente da verificare, però penso appunto sia una combinazione di effetti climatici.
Then you said that you choose a rather optimistic scenario of climatic change. What about the worst scenarios? Would it be an extinction of the IBEX?
Well, I mean, are you asking me my opinion, or are you asking a statistical question?
Your frank opinion. Thank you.
My opinion. Well, I can say we haven't done. Well, I'll say statistically, we surely would do something like that when we publish the paper. But obviously, this is an alpine specialist, and it doesn't matter what. I'm not going to talk about plants, so I don't know anything about them, but whatever animal, carabids or birds, or there's a lot of concern over. A lot of predictions would predict that these things are being pushed to the summit, and there's nowhere else to go. Right? Maybe physically because of the tree lines. It may be a direct effect of climate, or it might be both. Right? So these things are being pushed up and up and up. And there's nowhere for them to go. So eventually, and that is ultimately, there's many, many predictions that would say that, and we know that. So what can we do about it? I mean, the fact is there may be habitat management that can compensate for these kind of things, and they're the kind of things that people like us should be thinking about, right? So maybe, the question before was actually right. We need to check this, and we need to check it thoroughly at what's going on down there. Is there some kind of statistical artifact? Or is that right? Is there something unique about this area here? All right? I can't remember what I was going to say. But, when we suss that out, we can say, well, right, what, if that's not a statistical problem, what is it about this area which is good? And then can we manage habitats in the same way up there? Or maybe there's nothing we can do and it's just about local climate. So that's how ultimately we want to use these models. Anybody else? It's not. I feel I'm hogging the stage here.
I have a question. I don't understand why you focalize on the highest altitude, because ibex can live in low altitude. We have ibex in France at 300 meters of height, and I think your model is based on the GPS data. So in this study, we have only GPS on ibex in high altitude, but it's possible also to have.
Well, I mean, in that case, if that's right, yeah, you're right. Of course, we're based on this data, because in this region, it seems they only do that. I mean, this is an interesting issue. If that's true, then that is good news, because it would suggest that there's the capacity, in fact, to occupy warmer climates, so lower altitudes, and in fact, so maybe we've nothing to worry about. And the reason there are high altitudes is because of human disturbance, or because of urbanization, or whatever. Okay, so that's a very good point. But that goes back to the caveats I was saying. You have to, prendere questi modelli con le pinze, because there's no ecology in it, right? So you have to know things like that. I didn't know that, but you have to know things like that to interpret them. It doesn't mean they're rubbish. It means, well, actually, there's evidence from somewhere else that they have the capacity to live at these places. So what can we do about it? Create open areas, even at fairly low altitudes, protected areas, non-disturbed areas, even in fairly low areas, and they may be fine.
I think if you take in account the low altitude, you don't have a loss of habitat.
Yeah, but we can't model it with our data. If you want to give us some more data from low, you see what I mean? We're analysing what we have the data. You saw there were no ibex below 1,000 metres. So what, from the point of view of the data we have, that's what you get. We can't invent ibex. But if you have data, bring it on. But that is, that is extremely good point, because we'd have to include that in any discussion in the paper.